Poetry is vital to communication and expression and to understanding ourselves as well as others. Perhaps the most famous lines people tend to think of when they think of poetry is "Roses are red, violets are blue, the sugar is sweet, and so are you." You may have heard it in movies, you may have read it in a Hallmark card, but to attempt to summarize what poetry is just based on those lines alone doesn't quite do it justice. Whether you like poetry or not, whether you consider yourself a fan of poetry, chances are that poetry has had some role in the things that you do like, whether you realize it or not, whether it's modern music, art, movies, plays, or any other forms of artistic or human expression in general. I've written and read poetry for as long as I can remember. I've studied it in college, I've taken classes on it, I've done some live readings in front of audiences, and I've practiced writing it from a very young age up until now, all in order to develop and hone my own take and skills on poetry. First, I will discuss poetry itself. Second, I will discuss the different forms of poetry and the connection between poetry and other forms of artistic expression. And lastly, I will discuss why poetry is important and the relevance it has in all of our lives. Poetry is a lot more than just rhyming or the typical cliches that you think of, like "Roses are red, violets are blue," or some of the more famous romantic poems and all these sorts of things. Poetry doesn't have to be about love all the time. It can be about literally almost anything that you could think of. What is poetry? I figured that the best people to explain what poetry is are famous poets themselves, because they've practiced it and would understand better than those that are less familiar with it what it actually entails and what it actually is and everything that there is to it. Edgar Allan Poe said, "I would define the poetry of words as the rhythmical creation of beauty." This quote in particular points out the musicality of poetry, the rhyming, the flow of it, the way that it's, especially when it's read, you can hear the almost musical aspect. However, there's no instruments. The voice and the words itself kind of play the part of the music. George Sand in The Devil's Pool said, "He who draws noble delights from sentiments of poetry is a true poet, though he has never written a line in his life." I feel like this quote is important because it points out that you don't have to be a poet in order to appreciate poetry. Poetry is something that you experience when you hear it or read it. So you don't have to be a musician to like music. You don't have to be a musician to gain something from hearing a song or be able to relate to it. And William Wordsworth, in Preface to Lyrical Ballads, said, "Poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. It takes its origins in emotion recollected in tranquility." I feel like this quote kind of speaks to the process of poetry from the poet's perspective, in terms of how basically you're taking your inner thoughts and feelings and emotions and attempting to express them to the outside world through the vehicle of poetry. Poetry doesn't start and end with Shakespeare. A lot of people think of Shakespeare and Shakespearean sonnets and all the more traditional forms of poetry when they think of poetry. And sometimes this is what turns people off to poetry, but poetry is not limited to those traditional forms or Shakespearean sonnets or any particular form. It's even evolved these days to where lyrical poetry and spoken word and blank verse, which is said to be the closest thing to actual human speech in terms of poetic forms. So the influence of poetry is undeniable, whether it's in music or art or any form of human expression, really. Bob Dylan actually won the Nobel Prize in Literature in 2016 because of his lyrics. Even though some would argue that he's not a poet, the connection is obviously there, which is why he was recognized for his take on poetry in his music. Now that I have discussed what poetry is, I will discuss the different forms of poetry and the impact it has had on people. Whether you like poetry or not, the origin of poetry, just like the origin of music, music started without instruments in Mongolian chants, which were all based on religious topics. But as music evolved, people added instruments and started to venture into other subjects beyond just those relevant to the church. Now that I have discussed forms of poetry and the influence of poetry itself, I will discuss why it matters and the impact it has had on all of us. Poetry can teach us about ourselves and the world around us. It can be both introspective and external. It can be contemplative and reflective. It can make us think and explain our emotions in ways that we just can't do through just simply speaking. Any ideas, emotions, and experiences, all essential to the human experience, can be channeled through poetry. A poem can be literally about anything. It can be about personal issues, societal issues, philosophical concepts. It can give us a way to communicate beyond just speaking. If we couldn't communicate, how would we interact? How would we relate to each other? How would we learn? How would we experience life? First, I discussed what poetry is. Second, I discussed the different poetic forms and the relationship between poetry and other artistic mediums. And lastly, I discussed why poetry is important and what it offers all of us. Poetry is vital to communication and expression and to understanding ourselves and others. In closing, I hope you have gained a better perspective and understanding of what poetry is. I hope that maybe you'll give it another chance if it was something that seemed to push you away in the first place, perhaps because you didn't realize that there's a lot more to it than the more common examples that are usually given. If you can imagine your life without music or without movies or books or plays or even poetry, can you imagine not being able to express yourself or relate to other people or communicate or enjoy art itself? That's why poetry is so important. It's not just fancy words and things that are meant to go over your head. It's based on the human need to express and reflect and internalize, and then also outwardly communicate what the world is, who we are, how we experience life, how we interact with each other. That's why poetry is so important.